You know, once upon a time there was something called MapQuest. Remember that? Or just regular map books.
Oh, map books.
Yeah. And nowadays they have Google Maps and Waze. You are probably going to need all of the above in order to make your way through this next section of this chapter. This is literally like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Spiritual Galaxies, in order to understand what's going on in this particular chapter. So, you might wonder, where did that come from? Because we were just talking about ourselves. And yes, some of us might need a map book, and some of us might need a bit of GPS just to work out what's going on internally. But actually, what it means is, in order to understand us, we have to understand the context of where we live, and more importantly, the context of what lives inside our neshama. So you might recall that in our previous discussion, we spoke about nefesh, de malchus, de asiyah. Does that sound familiar? In other words, that you could have a person who comes from such a weak spiritual background that the kind of soul that they have is nefesh, which is the lowest type of soul, but they have nefesh, de nefesh, they have the lowest of the lowest kind of soul. And that nefesh, de nefesh, comes from malchus, which is the lowest dimension, of asiyah, which is the lowest reality. So that's what we spoke about, how it's possible that you could have a person who is, let's be frank, spiritually quite weak. Maybe you can even say spiritually inept. Maybe you can even say that this is somebody who is spiritually disconnected. Yeah, depleted implies that there was something there to start. They're disconnected. They kind of just exist. So now what we have to say is, okay, the argument of this chapter is that every single one of us has love of Hashem inside us. And that's a Yerusha, it's an inheritance, it's hereditary. It's thanks to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and their immense dedication to Hashem. As a result of that, we all have this incredible love inside of ourselves. Now, what about that person? What about that person who's so lowly, so disconnected? So, shall we call anti-Jewish? This person doesn't identify as Jewish. They don't like what the Torah stands for. They're out there fraternizing with their enemies, supporting them. That person, you've got to tell me, they have love of Hashem? Where, what, how? Where is such love of Hashem? Where does it exist? So, the benefit of trying to understand and make sense of people who make no sense is that at the very least, we start to make a little bit of sense. Meaning, when you've got to do this kind of analysis, and you've got to try and understand what the inner spiritual makeup is of a person who seems to have no spiritual structure at all, it helps us to appreciate that those of us who at least believe or convince ourselves that we have a robust spiritual structure, at least we can understand a little bit more about how we operate. So to be able to better understand this concept of what we call the inbuilt love of Hashem, it forces us to have to analyze the nature of a soul, and in this specific case, continuing from where we were last week, this soul that it sits at the bottom of the spiritual barrel. Nefesh, the malchus datzilis. Now, the thing is, to understand that, we have to expand the map. Because right now, if you imagine, have you ever seen those videos where you start off with, let's say, a person sitting on a park bench, and then it zooms out, and then you realize you see the whole park, and then you see the whole city, and then you see the whole country, and then you see the planet, and then you see the solar system, and then you see our galaxy, and it keeps on expanding out, and then suddenly you realize that what you were focused on and that you thought everything was about was this tiny little speck, but you've got to see the context of the entire world in which that speck lives. That's exactly what we're about to do. We're about to look at the speck called Nefesh, de Malchus, de Asiyah, who's sitting kind of all the way at the southern tip of, we can relate to sitting on the southern tip of the continent. And now we've got to contextualize it in the sense of, what goes on inside the inner works of that soul that is sitting so far away from its source. To understand that, we need a little bit of spiritual geography. So this evening, I don't believe we're going to do much more than just the spiritual geography that's relevant to this section. If you're looking inside the book, it's on page 76. And on page 76 itself, 76, and if you look at page 76, you'll notice that we were just over halfway down the page. And and we are, in fact, we're a little bit more than halfway down the page. And we are here. The first word on the line is ha-asiyah. Do you see that? The first word on the line is ha-asiyah. It's about 10, 11 lines from the bottom of the page. The First word on the line is ha'asiyah. We're starting from the second word on the line, which you will see is an acronym. Do you see that? It's an acronym. And if you're looking on screen, the acronym is unpacked. And it stands for the words va'af fal pichein, which means despite the fact that this is somebody who is nefesh, de malchus, dasiyah, all the way at the lowest point of spirituality, nevertheless, that nefesh, de nefesh, that lives inside of them, let's unpack it, let's analyze it a little bit further. So, because this soul, it's a soul. And because it's a soul, it belongs to what we call the 10 holy sephiros. Okay? Very important information. Therefore, he kelula mikulan. Therefore, this soul is actually incorporated out of these 10 sephiros. Now, right now, that's going to sound extremely abstract. Like, what on earth are you talking about? Not only that, but gam mechochma da'asiyah. That means that even inside this nefesh, which is so lowly, incorporated, encapsulated inside of it is what we call chochma of asiyah. And before we can go further into stringing together all the various elements of this map, let's just focus on this for now. So what are we saying? We're using an expression, kulula mikulon, that it is made up of, comprised of all of these elements. And gam, you hear that? Gam chochma dasiyah. Even chochma vasiyah. Okay, we need to understand what we're talking about over here. So start painting the picture. You're going to have to really use a lot of visualization at this point to try and understand what it is that we're talking about. The first thing we've discussed is that there are 10 spheros. That's the first thing it says here, right? Eser, spheros kadoshos, that the soul comes from the 10 spheros. Let's understand what that is. Then we can address the question of kulula mikulon, how something incorporates or comprises everything else. And then we can talk about this idea of chochma dasiyah. Okay? It's quite a lot of stuff to unpack. And that's only the first line. So when we talk about 10 sephiros, essentially what we're saying is this. Does Hashem have any form? Hashem have any form? No, obviously not. But when I asked the question, does Hashem have any form, what did you think I was talking about? Physical form, most likely. That's most probably what you were thinking. So all those cartoons, with the guy in the sky holding onto the lightning bolt with a big beard, that's got nothing to do with Hashem. Because Hashem has no form. Thing is, it's not especially advanced spiritual knowledge to know that Hashem does not look like that. Anybody who's got an inkling of spiritual awareness should know very clearly that Hashem does not have physical form. That's not what it means. So what does it mean that Hashem doesn't have a form? Let's talk for a second. Looking around the room, which things in this room do have a form? Everything. People, everything. Books, exactly. Chairs. Everything. The chairs have one kind of a form. The table has a different kind of form. The books have a different form. The shelves have a different form. The ceiling has a different form. The lights have a different form. The people have a different form. Great. That was easy. But did it tell the full story? Let's use the simplest thing that's in our immediate vicinity. So the tablecloth on the table. It's fairly simple, right? It's a pretty basic concept. What is the form of this tablecloth? In other words, if I had to ask you the question, what's the form of the tablecloth, what would you say?
Material.
Material. What kind of material?
Don't know. Cotton. I don't know.
Okay, I also don't know what it is. But let's just say for the sake of argument, it's cotton. Okay? Let's just say.
Thread.
That's one kind of aspect of the form, is the material that it's made out of. What else? This material could have been used for a shirt, it could have been used for a dishcloth, it could have been used for dozens of different things. So the form is the form of a tablecloth, which means that its form is designed to fit the tablecloth. That's part of its form. Okay, what else would constitute its form? Shape. So it's designed for it to be a tablecloth. Therefore, it has a particular shape. In this case, a rectangular shape. What else?
Thread.
Its color. Right? It's part of its form. Is that it's a white tablecloth as opposed to something else that was a blue or red or beige or whatever kind of a tablecloth. This is a white tablecloth. Great. Let me ask you something else. If this tablecloth is folded up in the cupboard, what is the role of this tablecloth?
Nothing at a time.
Taking space.
Okay, so what you're saying is the tablecloth is occupying space. Is that the role of the tablecloth, to occupy space?
No.
No. So what's the role of the tablecloth? To cover a table. It may not be fulfilling its role right now, but that's part of its form. It's not its physical form, but that's part of its form. Form incorporates all of the various things that give definition to what this thing is and what it's for and what it's about. So the problem is, if the tablecloth is folded in the cupboard, it's not able to fulfill the purpose for which it was formed. But it's not going to lose its purpose, which is part of its form. So it's got its physical form, but it's also got its conceptual form.
So do you still call it a tablecloth?
Of course you call it a tablecloth, even when it's folded in the cupboard.
So
Still call it a
it's
tablecloth.
not defined by its usage.
Correct. Well, it's not limited to when it's in use.
Right, I'm saying you
Yeah.
don't define a tablecloth
Correct.
as something that covers a table.
Exactly. Well, it is something that covers a table, even if it's not covering a table.
It's potential form.
That is its form, conceptually.
That's where we all
Its
acted
conceptual
out the
form is covering a table. Its physical form at that stage is in potential physical. But its conceptual form is that it's, okay, so good. So now if I'm going to say what is the form of the person sitting across from you at the table, you could say their form is their physical form, so they're this high, they have these features, they have this color hair, they have that color eyes, and all of that would be accurate, but that would not capture the full form of the person. That would capture the form of the body of the person. But a person's not just a body. So if I really wanted to understand the full form of the person, I'd have to also be able to measure things like their emotional makeup, their intellectual makeup, a little bit of their history, the personal stuff that they've been through, the baggage they carry because of it, the aspirations that they have, etc., etc. The many, 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 many things that make up the full form of the person.
Aspects.
So when we say that Hashem has no form, we're not just saying that Hashem doesn't have a big beard and a lightning bolt in his hand. We're saying that there is no measurable that we could apply to Hashem. Not even an abstract measurable, not even a spiritual measurable, because the minute you can measure something in any which way, so of course there's spatial measurements and there are weight measurements, but in the same way there are conceptual measurements. So the minute I try to apply any kind of measurement to Hashem, any kind of parameters, any kind of definitions, I'm wrong, because he has no form.
Is that only because of our limitations?
Okay, good question. So is that a function of our limitation? Absolutely not. It's a function of his infinity. Infinity meaning can't be defined. Can't be defined mean? So what does can't be defined mean? It means that you don't have the words. Words is our limitation. You don't have the concept, our limitation. There is no definition. That's his infinity. Okay? So why is that relevant to our conversation? Because it's a big leap to go from completely beyond form or completely infinite to creating our very finite world. So it's an infinite leap, right? It's an impossible leap, technically.
Yeah.
Technically it's impossible.
Yeah.
But Hashem is not bound by what's impossible, because that would also be then a restraint, a constraint. So the way Hashem decides to do it, because he could have done it any which way he wanted, the way that Hashem decides to do it is to first create a form. And even the word create is not correct in that context. So the first thing Hashem does is to essentially emanate a form and then use that form as the structure for creation. That form is called the 10 Sephiros, which means that Hashem has decided, he's chosen, that he will assume a very specific form that has 10 facets to it, which is, if you wish, you could call it the so-called spiritual body, of which the physical body is a reflection. So we're designed in such a way that we'll actually reflect how that works, and we're not going to do that tonight. How that reflection works, not for now. But the point that's relevant for us is the highest level of interaction between creation and creator is this interface of these 10 Sephiros. So when we talk about the 10 Sephiros, we're effectively talking about the closest experience that we can get to godliness. In plain English. Plain English. The first, well, let's not say the first. Let's say one of the Sephiros, not necessarily the first, because the first is we're going to get to shortly. One of the Sephiros is called Chesed, which is kindness. It's easy for us. It's easy for us to appreciate Hashem's kindness. It's easy because he was kind enough to create us, and he was quite kind enough to create an environment that provides our needs so that we don't have to live in this constant state of fear. Where's the next meal coming from? Like, he created a whole ecosystem around us that supports us, so we can identify his kindness. Does that mean we have an inkling about him? No, it's an infinite leap to him. But at least we have an inkling of his engagement with us. So that's one of the spheroids, is his kindness. Okay, just using it as an illustration. So what are we saying over here? We're saying that a neshama, a soul, even if it's at the lowest level of soul, nefesh, de malchus, da asiya, as we learned last week, like the least developed, most primitive version of the soul that you could get, at the end of the day, where does it come from? Where does it live? What does it relate to? What does it connect with? The 10 sephiros. Not directly, because it's a very, very downgraded, limited soul. But you need to know that at the end of the day, it has a plug-in to the 10 sephiros. We're going to try and understand what that means, that it has a plug-in to the 10 sephiros. So the first inkling that we get, which is a mind-blowing concept, is Kulula Mikulon. It is comprised of all 10 sephiros. Now, that's a fascinating concept. So let's understand how this concept works. Have you ever, this is a very 90s thing, by the way, been to a hologram exhibition? Very 90s. Like today, who cares? There's VR and all these other way more exciting things. But there was a time that was a big deal, that you used to go, wow, this is incredible. It's three-dimensional, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So I'm not a big scientific expert, but the basics, as I understand it, of how holograms work is you've got the base image on some kind of piece of paper, photographic paper, whatever paper they use. You then bathe that in the right kind of lighting. Out comes the three-dimensional image.
Those pictures
That's-
you used to look at and like...
No, not that. That's something else.
It's a
That's the
different-
illusions. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about an actual hologram. Yeah. Hologram. It actually projects three-dimensionally off the page. So it actually, it's really three-dimensional. Okay? Not just that it looks that way because you're tricking your eyes. So now that base image, which is a flat image, it's a two-dimensional image before you shine the laser light onto it, right? That base image is obviously on a piece of material, whatever that material is. If I take that material and I cut it in half, and then I only illuminate half the material, what do I get? You get the full hologram, just half the size. So it's an interesting concept. It's an interesting technology. And you can keep doing that. You can cut it as small as you want. It's irrelevant. You'll still get the full hologram. And you can take the rest of the paper, you can throw it, you can burn it, you can do whatever you want with it. All of the information of the whole hologram is encapsulated in every piece of the hologram. Not entirely unlike the concept of DNA, right? Where all of the information about the entire organism is contained in this microscopic piece of the organism. That's what we mean when we say klulo mikulam. You have something which is tiny. It's a nefesh, de malchus tasiyah. It's like the smallest, most limited, most unimpressive soul that you could imagine, all the way at the bottom of the spiritual barrel. And yet, what's coded into that nefesh is the whole system. It's a fascinating concept. So now that should radically shift our perspective. Our perspective is a two-dimensional perspective. If we're very creative, our perspective is a three-dimensional perspective. But effectively, our perspective is in some way structural or linear or hierarchical, which basically says you're either higher on the ladder, like in the corporate world, therefore you are a more senior person, or you have a bigger salary. So we kind of see the same thing spiritually. If your soul is higher up on the ladder, then you are a more senior individual, and you maybe have more spiritual resources. And if you're lower down on the ladder, that's no longer available to you. You're kind of on a shoestring budget, and you don't have access to authority. Now that is practically true. That would be the distinction between somebody who is like a super tzaddik and somebody who's just an ordinary Joe. The one is higher up, is more aware, is more switched on, is more plugged in, has greater resources, has greater authority. That's all true. But there's a massive difference between the hierarchy and the soul system. The hierarchy says the janitor, compared to the CEO, will never, ever cross career paths. It's not going to happen. The janitor doesn't have the skill base, doesn't have the education, possibly doesn't even have the IQ. Possibly. They're never going to get there. It's not in them to be the CEO. It's not in them to be the entrepreneur. It's in them to sweep the floors. That's a big judgment, and of course we don't mean to offend anybody who has a blue-collar job, but it's just to give that comparison. In souls, that's not how the hierarchy works. Yes, this is somebody whose experience of their soul, their experience of godliness is extremely limited because they are nefesh, the malchus, the asiyah. They are in this very limited reality. But if you had to do a DNA sample of their soul, if there were such a thing, what you would discover is the entire spiritual system that we call the 10 sephiros encapsulated in the DNA of their soul. They are oblivious. Much like a person who has a particular genetic part of their system could be absolutely oblivious to that gene. Now, the most common time that we see that, unfortunately, is when there's a genetic problem. And then later on in life, that develops into a disease. So the person's unaware of the fact that it's not going to change their genes just because they're unaware of it. But a much happier version of the same story would be somebody who's given up for adoption and discovers their birth family. And the birth family are actually the most wonderful people in the world, and was just circumstantial that they put them up for adoption. It's not like now you're now at the bottom of the pile of the family, because you're the Johnny come lately kind of thing. You've got to work your way up, and maybe one day you'll be part of the family. It's not, it's in your DNA. So the minute we identify that this person shares the same biological material as that person, it doesn't matter that they've had a completely different life experience. It doesn't matter that the one person went to Ivy League universities, which is not such a big deal anymore. Or they had who knows what kind of experiences and qualifications, grew up in the lap of luxury, and the other person grew up in some sewer. Doesn't make a difference. Your DNA is your DNA. Your DNA doesn't get diminished by your experience, or your lack of experience, or your lack of exposure, or your lack of education. So that's what we need to know. This is mind-blowing information. It doesn't matter where I sit on the spiritual hierarchy. I need to know that the DNA of my soul is the entire system in miniature. Maybe so miniature that I can't even see it, but there it is. The entire spiritual universe, these 10 sephiros, they live in this nefesh, the malchus tasiyah. And they might still seem a little bit maybe beautiful, but abstract. Like, what does that actually mean? What does it actually look like? Tachlis, bottom line, when I meet this person on the street, they're going to curse me out for being a religious Jew. Or that person's going to have absolutely no sensitivity to their own soul. So what does it help that buried inside of them, they've got this incredible spiritual DNA? So what? So we have to unpack further. Let's unpack further. So he says, Gam mi chochma da'asiyah. Part of that spiritual package that lives at the core, like within every cell of that person's soul, part of that is chochma da'asiyah. Okay, let's go back a drop. Back up about a line or two. What did we say last week? We said that it is nefesh, the malchus tasiyah. Do you remember that? We said that you've got somebody whose soul is nefesh, which is the lowest level, de nefesh, of the lowest level of the soul, de malchus, which is the lowest tier, da asiyah, of the lowest dimension. Let's understand that. That realm of asiyah, which is the lowest of 4 dimensions. We identified that there are 4 dimensions. Atzilus is the most spiritual, the highest. Then comes Bria, then comes Yetzirah. Asiyah is all the way at the bottom. So that dimension of Asiyah also has a structure of 10 sephiros. Because again, 10 sephiros, the 10 energies from Hashem, that is the basic substructure of everything that exists. So you need to find it again and again and again in every system, in some form or fashion.
Is it in every human being? Obviously.
In every system that exists. In every human being, there is not 10 spheres. In every soul, there is 10 spheres.
But when I'm saying Jewish or not Jewish?
That's a different question, which we'll address, just not yet.
Okay.
Okay? So now the question is, this world of Asiyah also has 10 tiers. The lowest of the 10 tiers is what's called Malchus. So we identified that this is nefesh, the lowest part of the soul, de nefesh, of the lowest part of the soul, because every soul has this combination, so it's the nefesh within the nefesh. And that nefesh of the nefesh sits where? In the world of Asiya, which is the lowest dimension. And where in the world of Asiya does it sit? In Malchus of Asiya, in the lowest part of Asiya. What's the highest part of Asiya? Okay, now we know the lowest part of Asiya, the 10th of the 10 Sephiros, is called Malchus. What's the first of the 10 Sephiros called?
Didn't you say Atzilut?
No, that's the highest of the 4 dimensions, the 4 realms, the 4 worlds, is called Atzilus. But in the 10 Sephiros, which is the first of the 10 Sephiros, the highest of the 10 Sephiros, is called Chochmah. Correct. It's called Chochmah. Okay? It's called Chochmah. Chochmah is the subject of a big chunk of the conversation we're going to have in this chapter.
Can I just ask one thing which confused me last week as well? You explained why Malchut is the very bottom. Yet, why do we on Rosh Hashanah say...
Good question. You have to park that question.
Okay.
Okay, it's a good question. The question was, if Malchus is the lowest level, how come in Rosh Hashanah we make such a big deal about Hashem being the king? So I'm going to park that question, but I have to throw you at least a little bit of a lifeline. And that is that our reality, everything of our reality, which is not just you and I as people, not just earthlings, but our reality means the reality of all of existence, only exists because of Malchus. In other words, the amount of investment that Hashem had to put in order to create everything was the least of his energies, called Malchus. And every Rosh Hashanah is the refreshing of that energy, called Malchus. Therefore, the theme of Rosh Hashanah is Melech. Not to say that Hashem is at the level of Melech, or that encapsulates who Hashem is or what Hashem is, but rather that just touches the lowest dimension, which is the source of everything for us. That's as much as we'll do about that for now. So the highest of the 10 Sephiros is called Chochmah. Chochmah is very elusive. Now that doesn't just mean that it's difficult to understand. The definition of what Chochmah is something very elusive. And we're going to talk about that. It's a big chunk of this chapter. So you might find us repeating stuff because I'm going to go through some of it now and then we're going to see some of it later on in the chapter again, but that's fine. We need the reinforcement. These are big topics and they're a little bit abstract, so we kind of need to revisit them more than once. What does it mean that Chochmah is elusive? So let's do this. In the human system, just like there are 10 Sephiros in the creative system, so there are effectively 10 stages that a human being will go through before they actually create something. When I say create something, it could be a project that you've started, a conversation that you want to have. There are many, many things that we have to create from start to finish, from A to Z. The first step in any creative process obviously has to be the initial idea, the spark. That is elusive. Have you ever tried to work on an idea where you've got to come up with something innovative, something fresh, something new? Have you ever noticed that the more you try to come up with the idea, the more elusive it becomes? That's Chochmah. Chochmah is not something you can catch by chasing. Chochmah is something that has to catch you. And that's why very often those brilliant brain sparks will happen when you least expect them and when you're completely distracted. That's why...
Or you just use AR.
Well, it's interesting you say that. It's interesting you say that because is AI Chochmah? No, it's not. It's just collating information and repackaging it. It doesn't have the capacity to innovate new information. Whereas the concept of Chochmah is to be able to completely innovate something brand new. Okay? Chidush, exactly. Okay, I don't want to get into the whole AI debate right now, but it's an interesting point. Right? So when it becomes sentient, it will be a different story, right? Okay, so the thing is that you could be, for example, in the shower, suddenly you got this brilliant idea and you don't know where it came from. For many people, and I hope it's present company excluded, all you need to do is start to do the Amidah and the creative juices will flow. Because now you are distracted from all the things you really are worried about because you're trying to daven. So surely your mind opens for all the things that you have to deal with and all the ideas and the things you forgot from your to-do list, etc., etc. Chokhmah, by definition, is elusive. There's another reason that Chokhmah is elusive, and it's alluded to in this particular story, and it's relevant to our chapter. The more I hold on to me, my need to solve, my need to innovate, my need to answer the question, the more I cannot hear something that's new. Because if I'm holding on to me, I basically am holding on to what I already have. And the tighter I clench what I already have, the less chance there is to be open to something new. So curiosity, that's a key to Chokhmah. And curiosity takes open-mindedness, and it takes a bit of humility, and it takes an acceptance of the fact that maybe I don't know. And that's why the Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos that we'll learn this Shabbos, Eizehu Chacham, who is a Chacham, which I'm not translating as a wise person because that's misleading. Who is a Chacham? A Chacham is a Chacham. Somebody who can instigate, who can activate the Chachma within themselves. Who is a Chacham? Haloimed Mikol Adam. Somebody who can learn from any person. Because if I can learn from somebody else, means I'm open. If I'm open, I can invite in the innovation. Chachma is elusive. Why does that place Chachma at the top? Besides for the obvious, which is you need the new spark in order to begin a system. Because the highest level of any system has to be open enough to receive from something outside of the system. In other words, the highest state that a person could be in is the state of letting go of self, so that something greater than myself can influence or educate or inform me. So let's say that, for example, a person wants to learn. It's a very simple process of a higher system. This is the person who has the knowledge, so therefore they're a higher system. This is the book that has the knowledge, therefore it's a higher system. And I would like to receive from that place. What do I need to do? The single most important thing I need to do? Let go. If I walk in over there with my agenda, then all I'm going to do is filter that information through my agenda, and I'm not going to get what it has to teach me. So in order for any system or for any person within a system to have the capacity or the opportunity to rise above the system, they need Chokhmah. What is Chokhmah? The capacity to suspend myself. So now you've got these four dimensions. Atzilus being the highest, then Bria, then Yetzirah, then Asiya. If I live in the world of Asiya, and I would like some of the perspective, the inspiration, the insight of the world of Yetzirah, what do I need? Chokhmah. I need to be able to let go of my Asiya reality, and that might open me up, potentially, to some of the perspective of Yetzirah. So there's just, parenthetically, an interesting connection between Chokhmah and Malchus, because they are both very humble states. Chokhmah is I'm humble enough to hear, to learn. Malchus is I'm humble enough to share. So there is a similarity between, there's a connection between them, but again, parenthetically. So the highest level of Asiya is called Chokhmah of Asiya. That's the part of Asiya that is open enough to be able to actually get benefit and influence and energy and inspiration from the next highest reality, which is Yetzirah. Okay, so now let's put this back into our story. Where does this soul live of this Jew who is so disconnected from the Judaism? Where do they live? They live in Malchus of Asiya. They live all the way in the least developed, most limited version of Atzilus. And in that place, where do they live? At the level of Nefesh, which is a very kind of, disconnected or dispassionate or insensitive part of the soul. Where do they live within Nefesh? At the level of Nefesh. In other words, the Nefesh within the Nefesh. In spite of that, in that Nefesh of Nefesh, there is the DNA of the whole system. Which means, for all practical purposes, they have a hyperlink to the highest part of their world, which is called Chokhmah of Asiya. Again, the whole Asiya reality is baked into my system. It's in my DNA. I'm an Asiya creature. Therefore, the whole of the Asiya reality is part of my DNA. That means even the highest, as it says, V'gam, even even the highest part of Asiya, which is very different to where I live. It's completely aspirational. It's completely willing to surrender ego. It's completely focused on what's greater than it. Even that is baked into the system of the nefesh, the malchus Asiya. So how does that help? Because shebetoicha melaveshes chochma de malchus datzidus. Because once you know what access chochma of Asiya has, it's going to shift the whole picture yet again. So we've done one major shift. The first major shift we said was, you've got a soul that is sitting in a very, very disconnected state, yet it has this DNA of the whole system of the 10 Sephiros in its world of Asiya. Therefore, it's got access to the highest point of that world, even though it's not conscious access. It's not awareness, but it's there. It's in my system. So now I've got to say, hang on a second. So what's the benefit in that? What does Chochmah of Asiya offer me? Well, you have to know. Chochmah of Asiya plugs in to something else called Chochmah de Malchus da Atzilus. Okay, let's understand this. There's a lot of stuff going on over here. I told you, you've got to bring your map. There's a lot of stuff going on over here. Typically, what you find is when they try and use a diagram to represent the 10 Sephiros, that diagram will typically be 3 columns. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Typically be 3 columns. So the middle column will go Keser, which is not part of our conversation, Da'as, Tiferes, Yesoid, Malchus. That's the central beam of the system. The right-hand beam will go Chochmah, Chesed, Netzach. The left-hand beam will go Bina, Gevura, Hoid. Okay, those are the systems. Why do they depict it that way?
Tanya usually count 1, 2, then 3, 4.
But I'm saying, why are they depicted in these 3 columns?
Well, spine, human body, you can.
Okay, you could associate. You could superimpose the human body onto that.
I've always
But the
seen it
primary
in
reason
body.
is because it wants to show you linkage between different spheroids. Some spheroids link vertically, right? The 3 columns. Some of them link horizontally. Some of them link diagonally. Okay. Now, let's be honest. That's just a depiction. That's not how it really works. Obviously, everything is completely integrated. But
Almost like a hologram.
exactly. But there is value. There is value in this, in depicting the system this way. You know why? Let's say I've got the system now. Again, whenever you look at these diagrams, they're always 2-dimensional. Let's make it 3-dimensional.
You could probably do that.
So, no, for sure you could do it today. Absolutely. Easily. So now you've got the whole system of these 10 Sephiros. We'll call them the 10 Sephiros in the realm of Asiya. Instead of having it standing vertically as they usually do, we're going to turn it horizontally. For no other reason except for the point I'm about to illustrate. So now you've got the 10 Sephiros going this way. And then the next realm above it, Yetzirah, is going to have the 10 Sephiros overlaid just above it, a few levels higher. And then the level above that will be Bria, and the level above that will be Atzilus. What will you find now? You won't find the same columns that you're used to seeing, which is Chochmah goes to Chesed, goes to Netzach. What you'll find now is Chochmah of this world links to Chochmah of the higher world, links to Chochmah of the higher world. It's a different system, right? And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because if something is defined by the same title, then it's obviously got the same properties. And if it's got the same properties, then it obviously has a natural connection with the other thing that has the same properties. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Let's put it into terms that we could easily relate to. Let's say that, let's say, for example, you've got 2 people who are kind people. One of the people happens to be a multi-billionaire, and the other person happens to be a welfare worker who volunteers for an organization and doesn't even take a salary. But what they both have in common is kindness. So then it's quite possible that the welfare worker can go over to the billionaire and say, I've got a project, would you like to help me? And they'll actually be speaking the same language, even though they live worlds apart from each other, because they've got these common properties. So in a similar vein, you could say, Chokhmah as it lives in Asiya, and Chokhmah as it lives in Yetzirah, and Chokhmah as it lives in Bria, and Chokhmah as it lives in Atzilus. Doesn't matter that these are, excuse the pun, worlds apart. They have the same properties. There's kind of a natural cohesion between them, a natural linkage between them. If there's the DNA of the whole system in every part of the system, then there's definitely the DNA of the much higher Chokhmah in the lower Chokhmah. Obviously, right? There's got to be this connection. So therefore, within Chokhmah of the realm of Asiya, which in our reality, because Asiya is our reality does not mean planet Earth. Our reality does not mean the solar system. Our reality does not mean the physical universe. Our reality means Asiya, which is a highly developed, complex existence that has a whole spiritual side to it that we haven't even begun to appreciate. Like we think we're big deals because we've taken pictures of whatever planets in various places, right? We haven't begun to scratch the surface of a reality that we live in that is spiritual. So the highest point of that reality is called Chokhmah of Asiya. You know what is naturally embedded in Chokhmah of Asiya? Chokhmah de Malchus d'Atzilus. Now, the problem with saying Chokhmah de Malchus d'Atzilus, it sounds very nice, but what on earth are we talking about? And that's where you need your...
The world above.
Not really. It's even...
Malchus of Atzilus, the world above, right?
No, that's the point. It's not the world above. That's exactly the point. It's not the world above.
Dimension.
And this is not even the dimension. So here's the thing. Just bear with me. So, because this is like really a lot of information all being thrown at you at once. Asiya, as we've discussed, is the lowest out of the 4 dimensions of existence. Atzilus is the highest out of the 4 dimensions of existence. Okay? Another way to say Atzilus is Hashem's form that he's chosen to use. In other words, what is Atzilus? Atzilus is Hashem's interface with the world, as opposed to Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, which are where other things exist, created beings exist. Atzilus is not a place of created beings. This is Hashem's interface with the world. To put that back into human terms, and we're going to run out of time. We're going to have to do this Chokhmah de Malchus d'Atzilus. We're going to have to do it properly next week, please God. But let's put this into human terms. Who are you? The correct answer is me. Because if you give the answer of who are you and you give your name, that's not who you are. That's a label that's been assigned to you at birth or at a certain stage in your life. If you would use your formal name, which is your title and your surname, or potentially it's a nickname, or maybe your name changed for a variety of reasons, that's not who you are. Okay? It's not who you are. So if somebody says to you, who are you? And you state your profession, that's not who you are. That's what you've dedicated your life to doing. If somebody asks you, who are you? And you say, I am happy, that's not who you are. That's the emotional state you're currently experiencing. You could even go so far as to say, I'm a happy person. Great. So that tells us what kind of emotion you're typically experiencing. It doesn't tell us who you are. If somebody says, who are you? And you say, I am a very skeptical scientific mind, we'll say that's great. So now we know how you process intellectually. It doesn't tell us who you are. So the correct answer to who you are is me. And if you don't know what that means, that's because you can never know what it means to be me. But I can create a whole persona to share. It's got an intellectual side, an emotional side, a communicative side, etc., etc., etc. Hashem does exactly that. Who are you, Hashem? I am me. Right? I am who I am. That's it. Right? No, this is I will be. But right? Who am I? I am. That's the answer. I am. You want to have an interface with me? Fine, I'll tell you. I'll share a little bit of an intellectual process that reflects my intellectual process. Again, it's not me. You're not capturing me. I'll share with you what it feels like when I love. I'll share with you what it feels like when I'm angry, so to speak. But that's not going to tell you who I am. That's the world of Atzilus, right? Okay, so the world of Atzilus is like Hashem's persona. To simplify things for our conversation, the world of Atzilus is creator. Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya are creation. If Malchus is the lowest out of the 10 tiers, then it makes sense that Malchus of Atzilus is the actual creator. The lowest point where he actually makes things exist, as opposed to anything beyond that, which is his motivation to make things exist, his plan for how things should exist, his feeling towards the things he's going to create, etc., etc. Malchus de Atzilus is what should be called creator. Coming back to Rosh Hashanah, Melech, that's referring to Malchus of Atzilus. Now we're looking for the hyperlink between Chochmah of Asiya, highest point of the lowest dimension, with Malchus of Atzilus, lowest point of the highest dimension. That's what we're looking for over here, because that's going to be our key to understanding how, despite the fact that a person could have a really, really limited soul experience, that soul is still plugged in to the source. But we're not finished with this. We're going to have to continue, please God, next week. You're definitely going to have a good night's sleep after that.